Hello, Professor Toybox here along with Sorcerer's Apprentice Mickey, and we're back in my Fantasia Toy Box for our next episode of Toy Box Tutorials. Last time, I finished building the puzzle that will give the player the combination to the color pressure plate puzzle that I built in episode 44. To get the combination, the player must travel to each of 5 different islands and push a button, and each button will change the color of one of the color changing blocks up there on the tower. And one of the problems that I noted last time is that the player won't actually see the blocks changing color if they aren't facing in that direction, or if they're in a position where they can't see those blocks. It would really be nice to show the player what happens when they push each button, and for that we're going to need a camera, and that's our topic for today's lesson. There are 4 different kinds of cameras, and you'll find them in the Creativitoys drawer. And the first one is the target camera. This is the camera that I use most frequently, and this is the one that we'll look at today. As the name implies, you can point this camera at any target you want. To the left is the angled camera. This is the camera that provides the view that you see in the Escape the Kiln and Brave Forest Siege games in 2.0, and the Toy Box Takeover game in 3.0. To the right is the bird's eye camera, which provides an overhead view similar to Violet's Stealth Mission game in 1.0. And finally, there's the sidestep camera. This camera changes the view to a side view, similar to what we see in the Finding Dory and Marvel Battlegrounds playsets. Now, because there are 4 different kinds of cameras, and each camera has a bunch of different properties, and there are so many different ways to use these cameras, things can get a little complicated. There's no way I can cover everything in a single episode, and so today I'm going to start a 6-part mini-series on cameras. My focus today is to introduce you to some of the basics of using a target camera. We'll look at the other types of cameras over the next 3 weeks, and then we'll spend 2 more weeks looking at some advanced camera techniques, like how to get certain kinds of shots and how to use multiple cameras together to build a cutscene. Before we actually use a target camera here in my Fantasia toy box, let's go visit a mostly empty toy box where we can do some experimenting and I can show you how the target camera works. So here we are in a simple little toy box that I built. I've set up a little scene over here, a little camp that I could use for a cutscene, but really it's just going to help us know when the target camera is on and when it's pointed in the right direction. So the first thing we're going to need to do is put down the target camera. And I'm going to place this over here, centered on that fireplace, that little fire pit. And the only way to turn on the camera is with a logic connection. And since we can't do anything with the camera unless it's on, I'll show you the camera behaviors first. So I've got a little button set up over here. All I've done is place that out of the Creativitoys drawer. And I'll open the logic menu and do a new logic connection when pressed. And we'll come over to the camera and connect. And that opens up the menu. And there are 2 behaviors associated with the target camera. You can activate it and deactivate it, which of course turns it on and turns it off. So I'm going to use the button to turn it on. And then let's just go ahead and press the button and see what happens. And the first thing I want you to notice is the message that pops up, because right now that's the only way to turn off the camera and get out of this view. But the second thing I want you to notice, and you've probably noticed this yourself, is that the camera view isn't pointing in the direction that I placed the camera. It's pointing at me, the player, instead of the fire pit. So the first thing you need to understand about cameras in the toy box is that they don't work like real physical cameras. It doesn't always matter which direction the camera is facing. And also the camera isn't always tied to the location where you place it. Notice as I move around, that camera moves with me. It doesn't stay where I placed it. Now we can change this behavior, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute, but I needed to point this out because it can be very confusing the first time you use a camera. So how do we get the camera to do what we want it to do? Well, we'll take a look at the camera properties, and there are a bunch of them. So we'll open up the logic menu for the camera, come down to properties, and let's talk about this one first, because you'll notice the camera stayed on until I pressed that button to turn it off. And if I hadn't taken note of that message, I wouldn't have known how to turn that camera back off. So what we can do here is, by default, this property, use defined duration, is off. I can turn that on, and if I do that, then it's going to use however many seconds that I set the display duration to be. By default, it's 10. You can take this all the way down to 0, but I really don't understand the point of that, because you're essentially turning the camera on and immediately back off. But I'll go ahead and set this to 5. And so what will happen is when I turn on the camera, I'm using this defined duration of 5 seconds. And after 5 seconds, the camera will automatically turn itself off. And so that solves one of our problems. So we come over here and press the button. And after 5 seconds, it should turn itself off automatically, and it did. So that's good. Now let's go back into the properties. And the next one we'll look at is the camera target. Because right now it's set to all, and all basically means all players. And what I really want to have it do is look at that fire. And so if we change the camera target, you can have it point at a connected locator, at a specific player, at a connected actor, or just the triggering actor. And so let's go ahead and connect up a locator to this. And we'll use that initially here. So I'm going to place this right behind the fire pit. And then we'll come back over to the camera, and I'll do a new locator connection. And we'll connect up to that locator as our camera target. And in addition to that, just connecting the locator by itself isn't enough. We have to come down to the camera target, and we have to change that to be the connected locator. So then we'll come back over here and push the button. And now it's not looking at Mickey, it's looking at the camp, which is what I wanted it to do. And it turned off automatically after 5 seconds. Now there are some other things you can do. Again, you can have it look at a specific player. We can also have it look at an actor. And so let's use Rex as a cast member here. And we'll use him for our actor. So I'll come to the target camera, do a new actor connection. We'll connect it up to Rex. He'll be our camera target. And we'll come under the properties. Again, we have to change the camera target to be the connected actor. And let's just go ahead and take the display duration up to 10 seconds, which is the max. And so now when I push the camera, or push the button to turn on the camera, now it's pointing at Rex. And you'll notice the camera follows him as he moves. So you can use that to connect to anything that you can use as an actor, which could be an enemy, could be a vehicle, cast member or townsperson, or whatever. So let's come back over here to the properties, and let's go ahead and take the camera target back to all for right now. And I'm also going to turn off the use defined duration. And we'll show you some additional things. So we'll come back out over here, and I'll push the button again, which will point at Mickey. Okay, so it's pointing at me. And one of the things I'll point out is when you walk behind something, you'll notice there's a little glowing effect, like an X-ray outline. And so this way you can keep track of Mickey as he runs behind things. If you don't like that feature, obviously, there's a way to turn it off, and some people hate that. And so you can come under the properties, and the property that turns that off is called glow through. So if we turn that off, and then go back over here and push the button, then when we run behind the object, Mickey's essentially hiding, and you can't see him. Now there's some additional options under here. We'll look at the camera type next. And by default, that's set to follow. And you saw what happens when you push the button for that. But just so we can remember how that works compared to the other options. Again, it follows Mickey along. And if we go into the background, it follows him. And if we move towards it, so it's always keeping the same distance between Mickey and the camera. So the camera is moving, and it's the angle that it's facing is wherever Mickey happened to be when the camera was turned on. And you saw when it was following Rex that it was at an angle. And so there's a couple of other camera types that will cause the camera behavior to change, and we'll look at those here. So if we come under properties and change the camera type, there are 3 different properties. Follow is the default. If we set it to stationary, what this does is it basically points in one direction, and it never moves. And so if we come over here and push the button, you'll notice once again we have the same view, but now the camera doesn't follow us. And we can run right up to the camera, and we can run away from it, and it just stays there. I can even run off screen, and now I'm running around off screen and it can't see me. We'll go ahead and exit out of the camera view. So that's stationary, and that can be helpful if you want the player to run in and out of the view or whatever the camera target happens to be. The other property for the camera type is focus. And what this does is it treats the camera as if it's on a tripod. And so if we come out over here and push the button one more time, once again the view starts the same, but now you'll see that it pans and follows Mickey. So it's kind of pivoting as if it were on a tripod. And of course, I can run up to the camera again. The camera is not going to move towards or away from me, but Mickey stays in the view at all times. And so I think they did this kind of effect in Toy Box Takeover when you're inside the little volcano. It's like the camera is in the volcano and the player is running around up the ledges of the volcano. And so that's how they got that effect. So you can do that yourself in your toy boxes. So that's the camera type. And that's how you can kind of get the camera to stay in one position, is using stationary or focus. I'm going to put this back to follow. Another set of properties are these vertical and horizontal offsets. So I can set an offset of 5, for example. Vertical offset of 5. And now when I push the button, the camera is up about 5 units above where it had been. It's still going to follow Mickey because that's what the camera type is set to, but now you have a little bit of an overhead view. And likewise, the horizontal offset does something similar. So we'll come back and put the vertical offset back, and we'll change the other one. And I'm going to set this one to be -5. And so now when we push the button, you'll notice Mickey's no longer in the center of the screen. He's off to the side, and the camera offset remains. And again, it stays that way. So this is kind of useful perhaps in a side-scrolling game where you want the player to be off to the side of the screen more than in the center. But with those vertical and horizontal offsets, you can basically put the player, anywhere you want to go. I meant to go back into Spark mode. There we go. So let's go ahead and put that offset back now that you've seen what that does. All right, another property would be the start and end transitions. And by default, the start transition is cut and the end transition is cut. And why they put these in two different places in the list and not next to each other, I don't know. But there are three possibilities you can do. Cut just automatically cuts from the default camera to this one. You can also have it do a fade. So we'll do a start transition of fade. And we'll exit out of Spark mode. And this does what you would expect it to do. When we push the button, the camera view fades in. And when I turn this one off, it's going to do a cut because I didn't have the end transition set. And there's one other type of transition, and that's called swing. And I wish I could demo that for you, but on the latest patch, on my Wii U anyway, for Disney Infinity 3.0, swing is broken for the target camera. So I can't demo that to you, but we'll look at that next week when we look at the next camera that we're going to take a look at. So for right now, I'll put that back to cut. So that's most of these properties. Oh, there's the use camera position to set the zoom distance, and that's on by default. And what that does is basically it's not going to do any zoom at all, essentially. So it's using the distance between where the player is and where the camera is to set the zoom level. So it's like the camera is actually at that position. And so when I push the button, you can see you've got the start pad there, kind of halfway between Mickey and the camera, which is where it really is in reality. And that's the distance that's used for this behavior. But if you want that to be a little bit closer, and you don't necessarily want to move your camera, you can come in here to the properties, and we can turn that off. And when you turn that off, now it's going to use whatever you have zoom distance set to. And by default, this is 20. And the units for this is the same as it is for the dynamic trigger. So it's basically 4 units per block. And so for zoom distance of 20, if we come out here and we go up to the blocks drawer, for example, and we come over to blocks, then Mickey's going to be about right here when he sets the button and turns the camera on. And if we put 5 of these blocks out, it'll be as if the camera is actually sitting here. And so this start pad should be closer to the player than it was when we were using the zoom distance to set the distance to set the zoom distance. And you can see that the pad is a lot closer, the launch pad. And Mickey is a lot closer to the camera. He's a lot more zoomed in than it was before. So if you look, for example, at where that launch pad is, close to the bottom of the screen, and how big Mickey is, and then we come back over here, and we turn that property back on for using the camera position. Now it's using the actual distance of the camera from the player. And now you notice that start pad is further out from the bottom of the screen and Mickey's a lot smaller. And so that's what those properties do. Let's go ahead and remove these blocks. The last property we want to look at that's on here is the player viewport. And this basically determines who sees the camera view. And right now it's set to the triggering player. So to kind of play around with that and demo it, let's bring in a second player. So I'll bring Mickey out here, and we're going to put Minnie Mouse on for player 2, and we'll connect her in.
Oh, if it isn't my good friend. I'm ready whenever you are.
Okay.
Is my bow on straight?
Boy, she's a chatty one. All right, so there's Minnie. And if I come over here and push the button, the only view that changed was Mickey's. And you can see the camera is following Mickey and not Minnie. So I'll go ahead and exit out of that. So it's working right now off of the triggering player. If we come back over to the camera, come under Properties, and we change the player viewport, I can have this be all players. And then when I activate that camera, something kind of interesting happens. So both views are set, but what's interesting is Mickey's going to go off this way, and you'll notice Mickey has gone out of Minnie's field of view, and the camera is following Mickey. But if I move Minnie, the camera is following her. So I have one camera, but I've got two different views. It's kind of like I have two different cameras, even though I really only have one camera. And from Mickey's control, I will exit out of the view, and you'll notice it exited out of both players' views. So setting that to all players gave that viewport to both players and had basically it worked like two different cameras. Now we can also change this view so that I can set it to player 2. And pressing this button will mess up player 2's view. But you can use this in kind of a combat type game if you want. So I can set the view specifically for player 2, and now the camera is following her around. And you'll notice pressing that minus on for player 1 didn't turn off the view. It opened the editor. So the only way to turn off that view is from player 2's control. So I can set that for a particular player. And by setting the camera target to be, for example, player 2, and pushing the button and turning the view on for player 1, I could actually spy on player 2. So that could be kind of a useful feature for a combat type game if you want to see where the other player is. The other player viewport is the shared viewport. And right now, since we don't have online multiplayer anymore, both of these options are essentially the same. So I'll set this to be a shared viewport. And now remember, I've got this position using the camera position for the zoom distance on. But with this setting, that property isn't going to do anything. And neither turning that on or off won't make any difference,
I'll just take a little break.
as you'll see in a moment. So I push the button, and you'll notice the camera has zoomed out, so we see both players in the view. That's because the player target, is set to all, for the camera target rather. And so it's showing both players, and as I move away, the camera is going to zoom out to make sure both players stay in the view. But both players are sharing the same viewport. Mwah! So there we go. So that covers the basics of how the target camera works. Oh, before we exit out of this and go back to Fantasia, there's one more thing I want to look at, and that is the logic connections. So if we look under here for the new logic connections, there are 4 trigger signals that this camera will broadcast: when it's activated or turned on, when it's deactivated or turned off, and when the player enters or exits the view that the camera is looking at. This particular one seems to be broken again on my Wii U with the latest patch. So actually, this will broadcast the deactivated signal as soon as I turn on the camera, which is kind of weird, but at any rate, you have 4 trigger signals that you can use. So that covers the basics of how the target camera works. Now let's go back to my Fantasia toy box and hook up a target camera so that the player can see what happens when they push each of the 5 buttons. So here we are back in my Fantasia toy box. So let's go ahead and place a target camera up here where we can see the color changing blocks. And I'll center it here on those blocks, just like that. And in order to get it to look in that direction, I'm going to put down a locator. And we'll put the locator right over here. I'll drop it down just a little bit. And so we'll come up to our target camera and we'll do a new locator connection. And we'll connect it to that locator as the camera target. And then we'll come up to the properties. And we're going to use a defined duration. I think about 4 seconds should be sufficient. And the rest of these all look fine. For the player viewport, I can leave this as triggering player. Really, I only have 1 player in here, so that's all right. But if you want, you can switch this to be all players, so every player will see it. Glow through is fine. Camera target is going to be the connected locator. And all the rest of those properties are fine. So now our camera is set up, and with the locator attached, it's going to be pointing in the direction that we want. So let's come over to each of our buttons now. And we'll connect them up so that a new logic connection, when pressed, it will activate the camera, which will play for 4 seconds and then automatically turn itself off. And the same for the other buttons. So new logic connection when pressed. Not only are they changing the color of the color changing block that they're attached to, but they're also going to activate the camera so the player can see what the button does. And same for this one. New logic connection when pressed. Come over to our target camera and activate it. There we go. Had a hard time selecting that. And 1 more button to go. New logic connection when pressed. Come over and activate the camera. Okay, so now I'm going to set Mickey down here on this island. And so now Mickey rides the rail and gets up here, and he comes to push the button. And now the camera shows what happened, that button has changed color. And if we were to go and ride the rail back and change it so we can come over to this island, and then we push that button, now that one shows that block has changed color, and so on. So that's it for the target camera. I hope the lesson today was helpful for you. Cameras are very powerful toys, and without a functioning text creator, they're the best tool we have for telling stories in the Disney Infinity 3.0 toy box. If you want to learn more about visual storytelling techniques, you should check out my storytelling mini-series. In episode 3 of that series, you'll see an example of how to use a target camera to convey mission information to the player and essentially tell a story. Next week, we'll look at the angled camera and how we can use it to build a game similar to Toy Box Takeover. Until then, I want to thank you for watching and remind you to subscribe to my channel or sign up to follow me on my blog if you haven't already done that, so you don't miss the next episode. That's all for me today. See you next time.